Hey guys, I don't know about you, but I am totally ready to read chapter 24 of Addison Cooke and the Tomb of the Khan because we were left at such a cliffhanger after that last chapter. I'm pretty sure that I know who stole the helm straight out from under Tony Chin's nose, but I just want to read 24 to make sure. So this starts on page 245, and this chapter is called Mr. Jacobson. Addison sprinted down the haunted corridor, clutching the helm like a rugby ball, his team racing after him. He expected rocks to be hurled from the shadows of the Mongol statues, but none came. Addison fancied his luck was finally changing until Eddie shouted that Tony was now chasing them and catching up quickly. "Eddie, I promised you Asia would be an exciting adventure. Please, if I wanted to be filthy, claustrophobic, and afraid for my life, I would have stayed in New York and ridden the F train." Addison arrived at the climbing chute and reached for a wooden peg. He realized there was no way he was going to climb out of this chasm faster than Tony Chin, particularly while holding a heavy steel helmet. "Let's go!" shouted Molly. Tony was running at her heels. "No, I'm going to fight Tony." Addison tossed Sir Frederick's helm to Molly. She caught it with both hands. Addison figured it was high time for Molly to copy the clue into his notebook, so he tossed his notebook and pencil at her as well. Molly was holding the helm in both hands, so the notebook and pencil bounced off her forehead. Addison turned to square off against Tony. He just needed to buy Molly time. He flicked out his butterfly knife and beckoned Tony forward. Tony paused, rolled up his sleeves, and nodded approvingly. "You're holding your knife point down. I'm impressed." Tony twitched his wrists and the trench knives were suddenly in his grip. Addison lunged and Tony parried. Tony lunged and Addison parried. Molly was desperate to watch the fight, but remembered she needed to copy Sir Frederick's clue into Addison's notebook. Addison circled and struck with his knife. It met one of Tony's in a clash of metal. Tony grinned broadly. "Good! You're improving." He danced around Addison, flipping the trench knives so they glittered in the dark passage. "Now, we need to work on your footwork. Always keep your balance. When you lunge, you're overextending." Addison lunged and Tony knocked him over easily. Tony stepped back, letting Addison return to his feet. In an instant, Tony knocked him down again. "Balance, Addison! Keep your feet spread apart, and no one can knock you down." Addison tried it and immediately felt sturdier. Before he could lunge at Tony, Madame Feng's voice screeched from somewhere high above. "Quit playing around down there! I haven't got all day!" Tony shrugged at Addison. "Duty calls." Addison saw a blur of motion followed by his butterfly knife sailing out of his hand. Tony caught the knife in midair and tossed it back to Addison. He grinned. "Keep practicing." Tony swiveled to face Raj and Molly, tripping one and clotheslining the other. He caught Sir Frederick's helmet as it flew from Molly's grasp. He needed to free his hands to climb out of the cave, so he simply popped the helmet on his head. Within seconds, Tony had scaled the wooden pegs up the chute, disappearing into the darkness above. Molly shook her head. "He is really good." "Let's hurry," said Addison. "Maybe we can still get the helmet back." The group climbed from peg to peg up the shaft. Their progress was slow until Boris appeared at the bottom of the chute and began climbing up after them. Addison found this to be extremely motivating. He raced up the climbing pegs like a cat up a tree. When they hauled themselves up into the cathedral-sized room, they spotted Tony, completely outnumbered by Russian gang members. One large Russian punched Tony so hard the helmet flew off his head. It bounced across the stone floor, clanging like a dinner gong, and rolled right into Addison's hand. "Goes around, comes around," said Addison. The Russians continued to attack Tony, knocking the trench knives from his grasp. Addison, wishing to keep things sportsmanlike, slid his butterfly knife across the stone floor to Tony, who scooped it up and kept the Russians at bay. Boris crawled out of the pit and joined the fight against Tony, backing him up against a wall. "Tony's in trouble," said Addison, "and I think he's a pretty decent guy." Molly tugged at Addison's sleeve. "We can't help him. We've got to run." Addison's conscience nagged at him. "You're right, Molly. We can't help him. But maybe Madame Feng can." Addison charged up the hidden steps under the 47th Buddha and burst back into the first cave. His team followed, leaping down each row of Buddha statues. Addison sprinted to the entrance tunnel of the cave and found Madame Feng standing guard over his aunt and uncle. Madame Feng spotted the helmet under Addison's arm and gestured to her bodyguard, Hu. Hu was a thick-set man with a face like a slab of mutton. Hu! Stop him! No, I need your help, said Addison. Boris is going to kill Tony. Hu paused. Madame Feng frowned in confusion. Apparently, she was not one to be troubled to know the names of her employees. Boris is going to kill who? Whom, said Addison. I don't know. That's what I'm asking you. Who is going to kill... You mean whom, not who. Who is going to kill who? No one is killing who. That's it, said Madame Feng, stepping forward. Who and me are going to kill you. Who and I are going to kill you, said Addison, thoroughly exasperated. Who screamed and attacked. Addison retreated from Hu and, to his team's consternation, fled back inside the cave. He saw that Tony had somehow fought his way past the doorway of the 47th Buddha. Boris was busy shaking Tony around like a bulldog with a chew toy. Addison whistled to snag Boris's attention and tossed him the helm. Boris unceremoniously dropped Tony and caught the helmet with pleasure. Addison was pretty sure he'd just saved Tony's life, but before he could savor the moment, Hu slammed Addison to the ground and pinned him. For the second time in 10 minutes, Addison mentally prepared to have the entire map of his face redistricted. He looked up at Hu's face, which could have benefited from its own redistricting, and was surprised to see a dog peering over Hu's shoulder. Mr. Jacobson? Hu turned his head and was startled by the sight of the giant slathering beast. Get him, boy! The Great Dane cocked his head and bent one ear, confused. Hu held one clenched fist hovering over Addison's nose, ready to punch. He hesitated, eyeing the massive dog. Come on, boy, said Addison. Attack! The giant dog only panted. Hu laughed. He wound up to punch Addison an even larger mouth. Mr. Jacobson, attack! Addison shouted. Mr. Jacobson leapt onto Hu, rolled the triad onto his back, and began licking him. Hu wiggled and squirmed, trying to escape the slobbering Dane. This was all the distraction Addison needed to escape. He jumped to his feet and sprinted for the exit. Mr. Jacobson loped along after him, tongue lolling out of his mouth. Addison caught up with Molly as they raced toward freedom. Some dog that is, she said, pouring on the speed. Hey, he just saved my life. By accident. I'll take it. Addison's team reached the final tunnel that led to daylight and skidded to a halt. Madame Feng blocked the cave mouth. 2 triads were still handcuffed to Aunt Delia and Uncle Nigel. Let my aunt and uncle go, Addison said firmly. Madame Feng looked down her nose at Addison and emitted a full, ringing gale of laughter. You're just kids. You have nothing to bargain with. Go run into the steppe. You have no horses or camels, no water for 500 miles. Go and die in the Gobi. Addison, we'll handle this, said Aunt Delia. You guys get as far away as you can. Several triads were already rushing closer across the cave floor. Addison, Molly, Raj, and Eddie sidestepped Madame Feng and fled down the final tunnel. Daylight glimmered at the far end. Russian gang members ducked into the opening, sealing off the escape. Addison spun and saw triads closing in from behind. They were trapped in a criminal sandwich. We're going to die, shouted Eddie. Eddie, you can die when you're dead, said Addison. He reached behind his blazer and drew Dax's flare gun from his belt. He aimed it at a rushing Russian and fired. The flare struck the man square in the chest, blasting him backward. It lit up the tunnel like a giant red firework, ricocheting off the tunnel walls and showering everyone in sparks. The triads, eyes accustomed to the dark gloom of the cave, were blinding by the dazzling light. The Vori, coming in from the daylight, could not yet see in the tunnel. Addison's team charged through the fiery chaos and into the light. They sprinted 100-yard dash down the mountain path. When they looked back to look, the flare still burned and fizzled red in the tunnel where triads fought Vori. Addison gazed down at the flare gun, still clutched in his hands. What an excellent product. I must buy their stock. Mr. Jacobson, for lack of a better word, embarked. He bounded past the group and greeted Dax at the base of the hill. Dax wrapped an arm around the Great Dane. Good work, Mr. Jacobson. Molly was nonplussed. What did he do? I told Mr. Jacobson to go find you. Gunfire rocked the cave above. What exactly did you do up there? It's a long story. Dax shrugged. He was getting accustomed to the amount of chaos Addison's team could generate if left to their own devices for an hour. Come on, I found transportation. He led the team around a bend in the pass, and there, to Addison's amazement, was a string of Mongolian horses. They were beautiful animals. Addison stroked one by the mane. Where did you get them? Stole them from that camel trader. Dax winked and mounted a chestnut mare. Told you I can get you in and out of any situation. Addison's team climbed onto their horses and kicked them into a gallop, escaping into the wilderness of Mongolia.